Alrighty. Now let's assume that we pick a sample, we get a question, and we want to conduct a poll. Okay, and we do everything absolutely correctly, scientifically, mathematically. We pick a really good sample. We make sure the sample's from the population. We make sure that the sample is random, and we even pick a relatively large sample. Okay, is there any way to conduct a poll where the poll results are going to be 100% accurate? What I mean here is, are we going to be able to conduct a poll, and after we figure out all the results of the poll, can we ever know for 100% surety that the results that we find in the poll are going to match up completely with 100% similarity to the results that we would have gotten if we asked every American or every member of our population the question? No. Polls are never 100% accurate, which means it's impossible to conduct a poll that is going to be 100% accurate, because there are a series of errors that are going to take place or can take place when you conduct a poll. Okay? So what we have to realize is that polls are, if conducted correctly, are very, very close approximations of what the general population are going to feel about a particular question. Okay? But we need to realize that there are some things, some errors, that can and do happen when a poll is conducted. The first thing that I want you to realize is there's what's called sampling error. Okay? Anytime a poll is conducted, there is a sampling error because you're only taking part of the population. The only way to know for sure with 100% accuracy how the whole population will feel about an issue is by asking everybody. Anytime you ask less than the total, there's always a chance that their answers are going to be slightly different. Okay? And the basic way that we measure that, or we can figure out what sampling error is when we look at a poll, is the most common way to do it is what's called the margin of error, or the plus or minus of a poll. Okay? What that means is when you see a plus or minus 3%, or plus or minus 4%, or 5%, what that means is that when we look at the final results, if 25% of the sample believes A and 75% of the sample believes B, and we have a plus minus of 5%, what that means is each of those percentages could be 5% higher than we're actually reporting in the poll, or 5% lower. In other words, what that means is if we have a 25% yes and a 75% no, then that 25%, if there's a 5% margin of error, could be as low as 20% or as high as 30%. And then the 75% that said no could be as high as 80% or as low as 70%. And the way that we as scientists or people who conduct polls can keep that margin of error as small as possible is by manipulating or changing the size of our sample. The larger the sample, generally, the smaller the margin of error. Because the closer you get to asking everybody in the population the question, in other words, the larger you make your sample, the closer you're going to get to what the actual response would have been if you asked everybody in the population. And we'll look a little bit more at this here in just a few minutes. Another issue, selection bias, deals with the sample. Okay? If the size of the sample is not representative, and what I mean there is the size of the sample is not large enough. Again, if we want to know how the American people feel about abortion, and we ask 100 people and they all live in Cape Girardeau, then the size of that sample is not big enough. It's not going to be representative of the whole country. Okay? And then the other problem is that sample is not going to be random. Because if we're wanting to know how everybody in the United States feels about an issue, and we only ask the question of the people in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, then that does not make the sample random. Because I've only asked people in Cape Girardeau, and if I never leave Cape Girardeau to find people to ask the question of, then everybody in the population doesn't have an equal chance of being selected. Okay? So the second type of bias that we find, or problems that we find within a poll, that make them inherently inaccurate is that sometimes the sample isn't truly random, and sometimes the size of the sample isn't big enough. Okay? And then a really big one that I want you to be familiar with is measurement error. Okay? When we're conducting the actual poll, there are some problems that could take place. They could be asking you a question, and you answer the question, but it's, the questions aren't measuring what they're supposed to. And a perfect example of a measurement error is if I ask somebody a confusing question. Americans don't like to look stupid. Or sometimes people ask questions that are confusing and they think they understand what the question is, when in fact the question was asking you something completely different. And if you have those confusing questions, what's going to happen is you're going to get a result from the poll that's not going to be accurate. Okay? Another problem with questions, not that they're confusing questions, but if they're leading questions. For example, if I was to ask the class this question, do you support Barack Obama's policies, or do you support George Bush's failed policies? What I've done is I've led you in a direction, because nobody in their right mind is going to support a failed policy. So what I'm doing is I'm leading you in a direction. I'm saying to you basically, do you support the non-failed policies of Barack Obama, or do you believe in the failed policies of Bush? Nobody wants to admit that they believe in or follow failed policies. So surely they're going to say, hey, I'm going to support the policies of Barack Obama. That can be a very, very difficult situation to deal with, especially if you don't see the questions that are asked. Because most of the times, as we'll see in the next slide, when we have a poll and we see it on TV or we see it in the newspaper or we see it online, you don't get to see all of the questions that are asked. You don't get to listen to the inflection in the person's voice when they're speaking. Okay, so questions can be very leading. So when we're conducting or looking at a poll and trying to figure out if a poll is trustworthy or not, or whether we should put confidence in that, it's really important to know who's conducting the poll. Because if we see a poll that's conducted by the Democratic National Committee and it says that 95% of the people support Barack Obama and only 5% are opposed to him, you can pretty sure that probably what happened is the Democratic National Committee asked those questions in a way that were leading people in one direction or another. Or what they did was they just picked out the data within the questions or the polling process that made their candidate look better. Okay? Or if the Democratic or the Republican National Committee was conducting a poll and it was very, very obviously skewed one direction or another, you could probably be pretty, comfortable in saying, hey, I don't know if I want to trust this. Not that the Republicans or the Democrats are going to lie to you, but they're going to present information to you that support their position. So it's really important that we know who conducts a poll. And it's usually pretty easy to determine who's conducted a poll, especially if it's online. There'll usually be a little link at the bottom of the poll that'll tell you, it'll actually take you to a website for the people who conducted the poll. A lot of times, really good polls that are conducted well, when you hit that link, you can get to all of the scientific process that was used, all the mathematical processes that were used. You can actually see the questions that were asked, those types of things. Okay? So keep in mind that when you look at a poll, don't take it as 100% accurate, because there's going to be some inherent problems with the poll, and there could be problems that the person conducting the poll has brought into the process. So when we come up to this next election, or as you listen to the people on TV talk about health care or gun control or gay marriage, or whatever the issue is, don't believe every poll that you hear. If you really want to truly find out whether or not that polling data is accurate or not, you have to do a little bit of extra research. Look into the process that was used. Look into the questions